going on, guys? Dr. B here, and I wanted to take a moment to do a video about how I'm actually creating a custom shade guide for e.max restorations. Now, to do that, it will require a little bit of work on your end just to get it going. It will be a little bit of an investment as well, as far as having to buy some materials and have some things available to do this. Now, really, the whole process is pretty simple. However, you do spend some time actually working on this custom shade guide. And what do I mean by a custom shade guide? Well, so far, I'm not very far into this process yet, but I've milled out some e.max crowns, and I'm in the process of firing these and then actually glazing these. And then I use a product called natural dye material to create a stump shade or a prep shade. And this crown, in combination with that natural dye material, allows me to create a custom shade guide to verify the shade of a restoration for any patients I'm going to do e.max on. Now, why would I want to do that? That's one of those things where if you look at the process of taking a shade, the majority of the time I'm using Vita Classical Shade Guide. And it's a great shade guide. It's been around for over 60 years, I think, by now. And there's nothing wrong with that shade guide. However, if you look at the tooth color spectrum, it doesn't cover a large majority of that spectrum. So if you have patients that have unique shades, or if they're outside of the spectrum that the Vita Classical actually covers, then you're gonna have a more challenging time matching their actual tooth shade to the final restoration shade. So there is limitations to the Vita Classical Shade Guide. And if you have something like a Vita 3D Master, now you're probably a little bit more advanced as far as what you can do and the spectrum that you can cover. But one thing to keep in mind there is sometimes dental labs don't always support the Vita 3D Master. If they don't have it in-house, then if you're using it and they don't have it, then it's kind of pointless. You can't really communicate the shade as well if they don't use that. The Vita Easy Shade is another great tool as well. I used that for a long time at my last clinic. I currently don't have it here at the clinic I'm working at now. It is an expensive item, but it's a really useful item to have. You can take a shade very quickly with this. It's literally like pointing this little gun at the tooth and shooting or pressing a button, and it instantly gives you a shade reading. It'll give you Vita Classical shade, it'll give you the Vita 3D Master shade. And so that's a super useful item. I would oftentimes use that from the get-go, and then I would use the Vita Classical, or if I had a Vita 3D Master shade guide, to kind of confirm and take photos of the case, take photos of the shade tabs up against the teeth. So I could communicate that to the lab. Now, one thing I'm doing a lot of now is CAD/CAM dentistry. CAD/CAM dentistry is amazing. I can do a ton of my normal pros or in-house crowns, single unit crowns right here. There's no reason why I have to send these things to a lab necessarily unless I want to. So I'm doing a ton of CAD/CAM. It's been a great thing. I don't know if you use CAD/CAM on the regular, but it's certainly, I think, something that I will always incorporate into my dental practice from here forth, because I love what I can do with CAD/CAM technology, doing posteriors, anteriors. I mean, you really have the ability to do just about anything you want with CAD/CAM technology. Now, there is cost for that. It does cost a lot up front to get that going. But it's super useful. And that's what I'm actually using to make this custom shade guide. So with a custom shade guide, you have a crown that is made out of the material that you commonly use. So I use e.max a lot for indirect restorations, whether it be in the posterior or the anterior. So most of our shade guides, if you look at the Vita shade guides, they're of anterior teeth. So what I did is I took a dentiform and I prepped number 8. You could use a model. If you already have a model that's prepped, you could do just about anything you want. You could 3D print a model if you wanted, if you have that capability. But I prepped number 8, and then I went through the whole process of taking this through the CAD/CAM fabrication process. So using Cerac, I'm currently running 4.6. I enter in the actual restoration that I'm going to be doing, so I select the tooth, I select the material, e.max CAD in this case. And then I go through the whole process of scanning the model, scan the upper arch, the lower arch, scan a bite, and then we go through the model work where we orient a cast. We basically tell the machine where the margin is going to be located so it doesn't have to guess there. Although the newer software does tell you where the margin is, but it's not always perfect, so I like to double check that. And then we go into the design phase where we actually design this restoration. I try to spend some extra time making it match the adjacent tooth, focusing on the incisal length, adjusting line angles and buccal lingual widths and mesial distal widths, checking contacts, making sure those are adequate. So you spend a lot of time doing this design and getting it looking nice. And then what I do is I go to the manufacturer menu, and now I'm ready to actually start milling out the restoration. And what I've done here is I currently have 3 crowns I've milled out. I'm working on A shades right now, so I have an A1, an A2, and an A3 that I've milled out from the respective blocks. If you haven't used CAD-CAM, each block is matched to a shade. So you may have an A1 shade block, you have an A2 shade block. So if I'm trying to mill out an A1, I grab the A1 block, and then that's what we mill the crown out of. So it's pretty cool process. And what's nice is I can mill out the exact same crown, so it's going to have the same contours, the same size. It's going to look identical for all of the different crowns I mill out. The only difference is going to be the shade. I'm going to have different shades of the same crown. So that's what I'm currently working on. I have 3 shades currently that I have done, and I thought I would walk you through the process for this. I've kind of already told you about what I've done on the Cerac side of things. Currently I'm ready to mill out another crown. So I'm going to mill out an A4. I could do an A3.5. I'll decide which one yet. I haven't really committed to that just yet. But one of the two, we'll mill that out. I'll show you what I do after that to get this to where it's useful, okay? You may be asking, okay, how would I do this if I don't have CAD-CAM technology? Well, again, you could take a dentiform, you could prep the tooth, you could do a PVS. My recommendation would be that you send the actual impression, or if you're doing digital scans, send that to a lab who can either mill restorations or at least be extremely consistent in the restorations they fabricate. It would be better if they could mill restorations. That tends to be a little cheaper because if they're having to stack porcelain by hand, things like that, it's going to take forever, okay? But the goal is to create a shade tab that is of different shades of that material. So, you know, an A2 on the Vita Classical Shade Guide may not be a perfect match to an e.max restoration fired as an A2. And so that's the kind of things that is helpful, is I can take these restorations we milled and I can kind of confirm the shade of the restoration before I commit to all the lab work of creating that. There is some little flaws there, okay? There's some things that you have to consider because number one, to make this work, you have to know what the prep shade is, or the stump shade. And to know that, you have to prep the tooth. And then we use a shade guide, the natural dye material shade guide, which basically is corresponding to various colors of prep shades. Really, it's kind of various colors of dentin shades, because if you do a full coverage crown, you're prepping away a lot of the enamel, leaving the dentin. So I use that shade guide to confirm basically the color of the prep. Now the colored prep could be variations in color. I try to pick the darkest, most prominent color as my prep color, or the prep shade. Now I can use the natural dye material sold by Ivoclar Vivadent to create basically a dye for these crowns we're milling out. And so if I know what the patient's prep shade is, I can take the prep shade from the natural dye material and I can create a die that will fit all these crowns, because all these crowns look the same on the inside because they've all been milled out from the same digital impression. And now I can interchange different shades onto that die and hold that up to the natural teeth and see which one looks the best. So that's one way that you could do this. There's also a great app on the cell phone that I use a lot. It's from Ivoclar as well. It's the Shade Navigation app. Basically, you input a bunch of different parameters. It asks you what your final shade you're aiming for is going to be. It asks you what the prep shade is, how thick your restoration is. You can get the thickness from the actual CAD/CAM machine by looking at the cursor details. You input all these different things, what kind of restoration it is, etc. And then it tells you what shade of block you should use and what translucency of block you should use. And what's surprising about that is if I use that Shade Navigation app, more times than not, it's actually telling me I should be using an HT or an MT translucent block versus an LT, which is low translucency. And the majority of the time, the blocks we have here are low translucency. So those are things to consider as well. So I'm going to go ahead and mill out an A3.5 or A4, and let's go through that process of how to create this. All right, so after this thing comes out of the mill, sometimes it'll get some oils on it from the milling process, so I'm gonna clean those off with the steamer real quick. So the next step is gonna be removing the sprue. After I get the sprue off, I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing ready to fire. So I'm gonna use some object fix, go ahead and get a crystallization pen and get this thing ready. And then I'm gonna use some stain, like a dark stain, to just label the lingual side of this thing so I know what shade it is. And then we're gonna go ahead and fire this. And then after it's fired, we will actually do a separate glazing of the crown and a correction firing after that. All right, so to remove the sprue, I'll be using this CAD/CAM lab kit made by James Clem. This is from My Singer, so he kind of partnered with them to make this. If you don't know who Dr. James Clem is, he's actually kind of a big figure in CAD/CAM dentistry. He has his own CAD course online, CAD Star, part of the Clem Institute. Great clinician, very knowledgeable guy. I've learned a ton from him, just in regards to CAD/CAM. But this kit's awesome. So if you're working with e.max or any ceramic, porcelain whatsoever, I probably wouldn't use it for zirconia, but if you're using feldspathic, Empress, e.max, this is a great kit. It's got everything you need in here to basically, finish and polish your e.max restorations. So I'm going to be using this burr here, this 882L018, to remove the sprue, but I'm also going to use some of these adjustment burrs here as well. So these will take off porcelain super fast. So I'll probably start with this, and then as I get closer to the crown, the part I want to keep, I'll switch over to one of these just to get a little bit finer contouring of the crown. And then prior to firing the crown, a lot of times with e.max, I'll use these green wheels here, these knife edge wheels, and this twist wheel here to essentially kind of give a pre-firing polish. Now if I go any finer, if I go into these blue, if I go into the blue or the red or the yellow, then we're getting into a fine polish, and we don't want to do that if we plan on glazing the crown. So I'm going to stop here at the green pre-polish wheels. All right, now we have the sprue removed, and I've kind of contoured the crown a little bit just to smooth out where the sprue was. And I have pre-polished it with the green knife edge wheel and twist wheel. And now I'm ready to prepare this thing for the firing process. So let's go ahead and do that. We're gonna use some object fix in the crown. We're gonna place that in there, and we're gonna follow that up with the crystallization peg and get this thing ready to fire. Now you can use different types of stains to label the crown. I'm just gonna write A3.5 on the back of here. And here I have an e.max CAD crystal stain mahogany. This one's a little older, so it's kind of set up and it really needs to be thrown out. Here I have an IPS Empress stain in mahogany, and I'm just going to use this because literally all I'm doing is just labeling the lingual of this. Just labeling it as A3.5 in this case. And this stain is actually fairly runny. Put this liquid out here to dilute it if I needed to, but it's pretty runny, so I don't think I'm going to dilute it any. I'm just going to mix it up really well here so it's all kind of incorporated. This brush here is a brush I ordered, relatively inexpensive. I mean, you can use any type of brush, but the size is what really matters. So this is a 000, so that's a really small brush at the tip. So that's something that you want to take in consideration when you're doing your staining and glazing, is not to have a huge brush tip. So this one, pretty small. All right, so the next step, we're gonna actually throw this in the oven. So I got this thing on the crystallization pen, object fix, and we've labeled the lingual A3.5. Here we have an Ivoclar Progmat P510 oven. You can use any oven really, but let's look at some of the settings that we would normally use when working with e.max. All right, so if we take a look at the oven here, we're gonna go ahead and select Ivoclar Vivident Programs. We have a lot of options here. The one I normally use is in the lower right, this e.max CAD Crystal/Glaze. And within this menu, we see quite a few options as well. If we were going to go ahead and put like a paint-on glaze onto this crown, and we're going to crystallize that at the same time, I'd probably go with this top option here. Speed fire is a great option if you're just going to crystallize the crown, or if you plan to crystallize and do a spray glaze. If I was going to do a separate firing and I'm going to glaze this only after I've crystallized it, I would do a correction firing. And so I'm going to do this crown for this shade guide in 2 steps. First step is going to be crystallizing it, and second step is going to be do the glaze firing. So for the first step here, I'm going to go ahead and do a speed fire. You may think, okay, well, you have some stain that you put on the back of that, is that okay? Well, I use such a small amount of stain, and really I'm just using it as a label, right? That's all that is just labeling the crown. It will be okay. I've done this on the other ones. It's set up fine, had no issues. So we're going to do a speed fire here, and we're ready to go. All right, while the crown is in the oven, let's talk about what the next step's going to be. Now again, I am firing that crown just to crystallize it. I did put no glaze on there whatsoever. Could I have done a glaze before I fired it? Absolutely, that's totally up to you. Now here's the thing, in my clinical practice, the way I am currently doing the most aesthetic restorations, which are anterior restorations, if I'm trying to make them look really good, a lot of times I'm not doing same day crowns, which is an option with CAD-CAM. A lot of times with those I'll do 2 appointments if I want to really play with it and make it look nice and not feel the pressure of trying to get it done the same day. So because of my clinical practice right now, I am doing 2 appointments for anteriors. A lot of times I'm not spray glazing anterior restorations. I prefer to use a paint-on glaze. Now the system I'm currently using for that is Ivacolor by Ivaclar Vivadent. In the past I've used the e.max Crystal stains and I still use those. I'm not opposed to those at all, they're great. So whatever you do in your clinical practice will kind of dictate how you make these custom shade guides. If you do spray glaze for everything, then I would spray glaze these crowns and call it a day. If you do 2 separate firings for your anterior crowns, like I'm doing for this, then you do it that way. So it's really up to you. The Ivacolor system, I actually got this not too long ago. It's a really cool system. It's got a lot of great things in here. Specifically for making these custom shade guides, this system here has 2 different options for glaze. There's a glaze powder, which you can mix with the mixing liquid to make the glaze, or it comes with a glaze paste, which is kind of already pre-mixed, so to speak, that you can put on. For the last few I've done, I've actually used the glaze paste, and it worked really well. And so that's what I'm using for the next step. So I take some of the glaze paste out and I put it onto this tablet here. This is designed to hold all of your stains and glazes and mixing liquid. Alternatively, I used this earlier. You may have noticed this. This is just a glass ceramic block or tile that you can get from Lowe's or Home Depot. This thing was 99 cents and it works great. I was trying to find a black one, but all I could find was this white, but it's nice, clean surface that you can put your stains and glazes on. Again, for brushes, something small. To apply the glaze, I prefer to use a 00, or a 0 would be a good one as well. You don't want a huge brush because if the brush is big, you're going to be kind of like slapping this glaze all over the place, and it's going to be a lot harder to control, kind of putting it on in a nice even way. And especially if you got some like nicks and crannies, you're trying to get the glaze in. I prefer a small brush personally. That's just my personal preference. So I have some glaze here, and this glaze I mixed up before, so I'll probably have to maybe dilute it a little bit just to get it to be a good working consistency. You can leave your stains and glazes out. I leave it in this specific little cassette here that has a lid on it, and then I usually put that in a drawer. I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to buy a Tupperware kind of container that I can put this in that kind of seals it, and maybe put some wet gauze in there, kind of create like a humidor to keep this stuff from drying out, because over time the liquid in this glaze or in any of the stains that you mix up will dry out, and that's something you need to consider. So a lot of times if they have been sitting for a little bit or they've been on the counter for a little bit, over 24 hours, you probably lost some of that liquid. I would mix in some liquid just to make sure that it's a good consistency for applying it to the crown. All right, so let's go check on the crown, see if it's ready. As soon as it's done, we'll come back here, we'll put the glaze on, and we'll do a correction firing. All right, so I just pulled the crown out. It's still a little hot, so we're gonna have to wait a few seconds on the glazing portion. But there's another thing we need to talk about for this glazing step. Now, when you're applying a separate glaze to a crown after it's already been fired, you will have to refire that. So you need a way to hold the crown, apply the glaze, and not get your fingers all over the crown or even have an obstruction preventing you from getting the glaze onto the crown very easily. So I could do this one of two ways. I could reapply Object Fix to the crown and put a crystallization pin back in there just like we did earlier, and I could apply the glaze on to the crown doing it that way. Or I could use what's called the natural dye material, and you heard me talk about this earlier. So the natural dye material is made by Ivoclar Vivadent. This is designed to basically replicate the color of the prep. I mentioned earlier that you can use a prep shade guide, which is this right here, the natural dye material prep shade guide. And you're gonna pick which one of these is closest to the actual prep of the tooth. So you can use this to help you get a better understanding of what your crown's gonna look like on the natural tooth while you're still working on it and characterizing it and glazing it. For the custom shade guide, this is gonna represent the dye that all these different crowns are gonna sit on. Now, if I was you, I would start by making the most popular shades that you use on the regular. For me, that's like A shades, maybe some B shades. And so I'll make all these different crowns in different shades. And then there's 9 different dye shades in here. And they come in these little composite syringes. And it feels just like composite when it comes out. It's like a putty almost. But we're going to make custom dyes for all of these different shades that we can put these different crown shades onto. So what I'm going to do for applying the glaze is I'm just going to go ahead and create a custom dye using one of these shades here that we can put inside the crown, and we can hold this, basically put the crown on this and hold this specific dye here to allow us to apply the glaze to the crown without touching it or worry about messing up the glaze we're putting on. So that's going to be the next step, is creating a custom dye for the crown. All right, here's what we got. This is out of the oven. I got the Object Fix cleaned out for the most part. And we have on the back a 3.5, so that allows us to know which crown this is or what shade this represents, because again, all these crowns are going to look the same except for the shade, so that's where it's going to get a little tricky, right? All right, so let's go ahead and get this thing ready to glaze. So this natural dye kit comes with these different types of composites, right? These different types of materials. Here's an ND3, so that corresponds to a specific shade on that shade guide. And then you'll see here, this is a twist syringe, but this material is basically just like composite, very similar. I've already got some out, so I'm going to use that. I'll put this back up. There's also these little pins here, or these little pegs, I guess you could say, that you put the material on one of these and then you stick the crown onto the material. So let's see what that looks like. So here I have some of the material onto one of these pegs, and this stuff is super sticky, okay? Like, I don't know if you can tell, but my gloves stick to this really easy. And whether you're wearing gloves or not, whether you're wearing, you know, just your gloves or your no gloves, it's going to be sticky stuff. Because this is so sticky, you're going to need some kind of wetting agent or something to keep it from sticking inside the crown. So I like to use just some water. And that really seems to help out a lot by getting this wet. Okay, and we're just going to shape it how I really want here, but remember, we got to stick this in the crown. So I like to make it a little more pointy on the end, so it kind of fits into the crown a little bit better. Got the crown here, and we're just going to slide that in just like so. And we're going to shape it around the crown. We're just creating a custom dye. This is a little wet from using the water, so I'm just going to dry this off a little. I don't want it wet when I actually apply the glaze, so that's why we're doing that. All right, let's get the glaze ready. All right, so here I have some of the glaze
already mixed up. It's not a bad consistency actually. So if it was a little thicker, I may be thinking about adding some diluting liquid. I want something that paints on to the crown pretty easily. I don't want it so thin or runny that it doesn't stick well. That's kind of not staying in place. But I don't want it super thick either, where when you apply it on, you're going to see that the material is actually leaving brush strokes in the glaze that you're applying. So if it's going on kind of thick, we may have to dilute it a little bit, but this looks pretty good. It's also handy to have some alcohol wipes, like a 2x2 soaked in alcohol nearby, just rubbing alcohol that you can clean your brushes with if you need to. All right, so let's go ahead and put some glaze on this baby. So I'll kind of apply this all over, and then we'll kind of thin it out a little bit. It's actually really hard to do this and record at the same time. Normally I'd wear loops, and it's hard to wear loops when the camera's right in my face. And the focus on this thing is a little finicky, so I have to set it, and then I can't really move a whole lot, so it's really kind of difficult to record this. But that's not your problem though, right? So it's certainly tricky. I just want you to know that. All right, so that looks pretty good. Happy with that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to throw this into the oven and do a correction firing. All right, for this setting, we're going to go back to Avalar Programs, CAD Crystal Glaze, and we're going to do a correction firing since we're doing a glaze firing only. All right, while the crown is doing the glaze firing, it's gonna be a little bit, it's probably gonna be about 15 more minutes before that will even be ready to come out of the oven. It's gonna be super hot. I'm gonna pull one of those tricks like they do on the cooking shows where they put the food in the oven and then they're like, oh, and I already have one finished here that we can take a look at for the sake of time, right? So I'm gonna show you what the A1 crown I did recently looks like when it comes out of the glaze firing, so you can get an idea of what this is going to look like afterwards. So let's take a look. All right, so here we have the A1 crown that I did the other day after the glaze firing, and you can see, I mean, that looks pretty, right? The glaze on there, we got the stain on the back that's labeled crown A1. So this gives me an idea now what my e.max A1 crown is going to look like after it's been fired and glazed. Now I'll have a series of these crowns that I can use after I've prepped the tooth. I can pull these out. I can find the natural dye material that most closely replicates the prep, and then I can place this onto these crowns. And if I think, hey, you know what, I think this patient is an A1, then what I do is I place this onto the dye, the corresponding dye for the patient, and I'll have an A1 crown on there, and then I'll put this in the mouth and I'll see how it looks with the natural teeth. I'll basically use it like I would a normal shade guide. I'll just stick it right up against the natural teeth and see how it looks. And maybe I determine, hey, you know what, this A1's a little bright. So then I can take this off. I can pop on an A2 and then repeat the process and see which one looks the best. Now there is some pros and cons to this. Pro would be, you know, we're using the material that we're planning on restoring with, right? A con would be if you're doing this, you have to know the prep shade so you can use the natural dye material to replicate that prep. So that means that you've already cut the tooth, and that means that the teeth are probably a little dehydrated. So that's going to be something you need to factor in as well. It could give you a little bit of a false representation if the teeth, the natural teeth, are dehydrated. But certainly this is a cool way of seeing what your final material is going to look like, because it's most closely replicating the natural teeth and using the restoration that you plan to use for your patient. And you can tell that this dye material does make a difference when it's on there. Now if you use an opaquing cement, the dye material is going to be less important, or the color of the prep, I should say, is going to be less important. But if you want to get some consistency in some of your restorations, one of the best things to do is to use this kind of material here to see what your crown's going to look like, and then just use a translucent cement. And that's going to give you a lot of consistency, because now your cement's not going to play a huge factor in the final outcome. It's going to look a lot like it does here. So these are just some tips that things that I think come in handy. Hope you find this useful. We could do this for e.max, we could do this for Empress, we could do this for whatever material that we use in the office. And again, you know, how many shades do you want? That's up to you. I'm going to do some A shades, I'm going to do some B shades, and I'll start there, and then I'll see how it goes. I'll use this on some cases and make more if I need to, make adjustments if I need to, but this is the process I use to make a custom shade guide. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, and I'll see you next time.